Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for your final Wordstock storyteller, Shanna Germain.
So when I was a teenager, I was not interested in horses. I was not interested in sports. I played soccer on the guys' team, but only because I had time on my hands. I was not interested in movies. I wasn't particularly interested in the fact that I was raised on a farm and we had all these animals. As a teenager, I was only interested in two things: writing fiction and having sex. Now, because I was a very shy, very introverted, very geeky teenager, I didn't know how to do either of these things, and I had never done either of these things. I just thought that they were something that I wanted to do. Now, in my family, my father has a saying, which is that you can be anything you want to be. And so because I wanted to be a fiction writer and a sex haver, I thought that I would do what we do in our family, and I would learn how to do both of those things. And the way that you learned how to do those things first was by reading. So in order to learn how to write fiction, I started by reading. And I'd always been a fiction reader, but now I started reading nonfiction. And I started reading books about how to write fiction. And then I did what you do second, which is I started practicing. So I got this beautiful leather journal, which probably says a little about my leather interests now, but that's another story. So I got this beautiful leather journal with this creamy paper and this wonderful pen, and I started writing fiction stories. Of course, I didn't really know what that meant to write a fiction story, so I was just kind of writing things. And then because I was also interested in learning how to have sex, I did what you do, which is that you go and find something to read. And in my house, you stored the secret things in a couple of places. One of those places was my mother's underwear drawer, and one of those places was the basement. Now, the basement was full of spiders, and to this day, I'm very, very afraid of spiders, but there were also these really cool Playboy magazines in the basement. And so every time my parents left the house, I would do what you do, and I would go to the secret places, and I would read The Joy of Sex from my mother's underwear drawer, and I would read Playboy from my father's stash in the basement with all the spiders, which probably has a little bit to do with the fact that I'm bisexual, but that's also another story. So I would read and read and read, and I would try to figure out what the whole sex thing meant. Now, my parents are pretty liberal, and so there were also copies of things like A Woman's Body and books that had to do with educating sex, but I found those less interesting. They were really sort of how-to manuals, and I wasn't as interested. There was something there that I wasn't getting. So then I decided to do what you do, which is I started trying to have sex, which at that point mostly involved kissing. So I started kissing people, and I wanted to keep track so that I could understand. So in my journal with all the fiction, I started a list. And the list went something like this. Number 1, Mike, tastes like onions. Now I knew, because I had read all this stuff, that kisses weren't supposed to be like that. And so I didn't give up, despite the fact that I did not find them very pleasant. And so it was number 2, Valerie, where is vanilla chapstick? And so I had this wonderful list of people that I was kissing as I was learning how to kiss. And the list ended with Daniel. And Daniel was the first boy that I had actually dated. And so we were actually kissing a lot. And so I had like little hearts next to his name, and I had little stars. And I didn't have any of the sort of true love forever or Mrs. Daniel what's it's what, because it wasn't about love for me. It was about sex, and I was trying to figure that out. But at one point, I wrote next to his name, the best ever, because so far, he was the best person that I had kissed. And then I did what you do with secret things, and I put it in the place in my house that was secret, which in my mind was my mother's underwear drawer in the basement. And thankfully, I was smart enough to figure out that the underwear drawer was not a good choice, but I did put my book down in the basement with the Playboy, because I thought it was a secret space, and it didn't occur to me yet that it wasn't my secret space, it was someone else's secret space. So imagine my surprise when I go down to the basement, and my book of fiction and my story of kissing and my list of kissing is not there. And I'm in the basement, and I hate the basement, right? It's full of spiders, and it's dark, and this is where the washing machine lives, and it's just one of those places that, for me, just, said nothing about sex. It was all about secrets. And I'm in the basement, and I turn around, and I'm sort of in my brain trying to figure out where this book of mine has gone, this thing that is so important to me. And there is my father, and he has the book in his hand. And he has this look on his face, because the lights are all yellow in the basement, and he wears really thick glasses, and he had this look. And I realized that I had never seen my father mad before. And that my father mad was this quiet, silent stillness. And I was so afraid. And I realized that as we were standing there, that I had never been afraid of my father before, and I didn't know why I was afraid. And he held up the book, and he said to me, "Do you know what this means?" And I got it. I was like, holy shit. I had heard of parents who were sad about their children's choices for careers, and my father was pissed that I wanted to be a writer. And I was like, oh my God, I want to be a writer. He's so mad. How is this happening? My father's totally liberal. What is going on? And then he flipped to the page with the list. And I had a moment where I realized that he didn't care at all that I wanted to be a writer. Not interested in that. It was the list that had freaked him out. And so I'm standing there, and my father is standing there, and he's holding the page open to the list. And there's my words, my kissing list, and there's my Daniel is the best ever. And we just kind of stood there for a really long time. And I'm a crier. I was already starting to cry. The tears were coming down my face. I didn't lift my hand to wipe it away because I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. And he said to me, "This means that you're a slut." And I was standing there, and the first thought I had was, but it's not, it's just kissing. Like, that was my first thought. I wanted to explain to him that it was just kissing, that it wasn't sex, that I hadn't had sex, that I wasn't, and I was having this sort of panic moment. And then I realized that in truth, it didn't matter. Because although I hadn't heard the word slut probably before, and I didn't know what it meant, as soon as he said it, I had a realization that I wanted to be a slut. That I was my father's worst nightmare. Because the real reason I played soccer, it wasn't because I had time on my hands, it was because of those boys. Oh, they're sweaty and they're running around in the dirt and the way they smelled. And I tried smoking, and it wasn't because it was cool. It was because there were these girls in the senior lounge who weren't even seniors, and they just had the cigarette, and they had the eyeliner, and they had that smell, which in my era was poison. And, I would just walk by them, and they made the back of my knees sweat. It was just unbearable to be near them. And so when my father said that, I realized that he was right, that I did want to be a slut, even though I didn't know what that meant, and even though I didn't know how, and that was what I was building toward in my life. And I just started crying harder, and the snot was running down my face, and I was bawling, and I couldn't do anything because I knew that I didn't deserve to even lift my hand to wipe my hands, to just wipe everything away from my face. And as he stood there, and as I stood there, we were just kind of sort of having this moment of squaring off, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know where to go. And he took the page, and he ripped it out of the book, and he crumpled it in his hands. And it was the first time that I had ever wanted to take back something that I had written. I wanted to stuff it back into my body so that it had never happened, so that I had never admitted it, so that it had never come out of me. I just wanted to make it go away. And I had, for the very first time in my life, this moment of wanting to take all of those things back. And if you're a writer, you know that this is a moment you struggle with your whole life, and especially if you're a writer about sex. Now, at that point, I wasn't a writer about sex. I didn't combine the sex and the fiction at all. I was still just writing fiction that didn't have anything to do with sexuality. So he pulled that page out of the book, and he crumpled it up in his hand. And he said to me, "Promise me never again." And before I could answer, before I could even come up with anything, before I even understood exactly what he was asking of me, he turned around and he went up the stairs. And he left me there without my book, crying in the dark with the spiders and the yellow light and the washing machine. And I just knew that the reason he had left me there was because I was everything he was afraid I was going to be. And that what he had realized was that his promise to me, which was that I could be anything that I wanted, had backfired on him very, very badly. And I say that now, and I can say it sort of funny, but at the time, it was devastating. So devastating that I stopped writing fiction. So devastating that I stopped kissing people. It was 2.5, maybe even 3 years before I kissed someone again and had sex. I didn't start writing fiction again until 2001, which was 13 years later. And the reason for that was because I didn't want to disappoint my father, right? We all have that thing. So here's the part of the story that I didn't know as a child, that I didn't know as a teenager, which was that he did not leave and go up those stairs because he was afraid that I was everything he didn't want me to be. He left and went up those stairs because he didn't want me to promise him that I wouldn't do that. Because he understood, even as he was asking me that all of the things he had taught me about being everything I wanted to be meant that I could be everything I wanted to be. And that by him asking me to promise him that I wouldn't become a slut, that I wouldn't become a writer, that I wouldn't kiss boys, that he was going against everything he had spent his whole life teaching me. But it took us 10 or 12 years before we started having that conversation. And that conversation happened because in 2001, I wrote my first piece of erotica, and I sent it off and it got published, and it got picked up for Best American Erotica, which was fantastic and awful because and I write under my own name. So I had to have this conversation with my father that began with that story. And I said, "Do you remember?" And of course, my father remembered it entirely differently because it is our lives. And even as we tell nonfiction, we change them and turn them into stories. And he told me then, when we had that conversation, that is why he had left. That understanding that he was asking me for something that he didn't actually want me to give was the reason that he had left before I could make him a promise like that. And so I sent him a copy of the book, and I said, "You don't have to read it, but I want you to know that the values you instilled in me are the reason that I'm having this success, and I owe you a lot." And he said to my stepmom at the time, he said, "She's in that book, isn't she?" And to which my stepmom actually said, "Yeah, and you'd be reading it if it wasn't written by your daughter." And so at this point, the fact that he actually tells our relatives and he tells his friends what his daughter does for a living, and the fact that he sometimes will actually say to them, "She's way better than that 50 Shades of Grey book," means that we've come to a pretty good place. And the thing that I've realized really recently, after having some conversations with him and after thinking about this story, is that I have become everything that I always wanted to be. I'm a writer, I'm a sexual creature, I'm a sex writer, and perhaps most importantly, I'm a daughter that my father is really, really proud of.